After World War II, two superpowers emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union, the two biggest powers with two different political systems, the communist setup of the Soviet Union and the Democratic Republic of the United States of America. In America, the majority of the people violently opposed communism. In the United States, there was a perceived threat of communists in America. This would come to be known as the Red Scare. The situation was so serious that federal employees were analyzed to determine whether they were sufficiently loyal to the government. Both of the superpowers had success with new weapons of mass destruction. The United States successfully tested the first nuclear weapon in 1945 and the Soviets in 1949. Europe was divided by, as Winston Churchill stated, an Iron Curtain. On the western part of Europe, democracy with the influence of Great Britain and the United States. On the eastern part, communism influenced by the Soviet Union. Germany was split up between the three, as was the capital of Berlin. Since the Soviet Union had controlled the eastern part of Germany, they closed off the ports for America and Great Britain to import goods. Since people in Berlin needed to get supplies such as food, Great Britain and America airlifted it to them. Tensions in America began to rise over civil rights. United States citizens protested Jim Crow laws, and civil rights activists such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. began to rally people against these laws. This had divided America between racism and equality. In the midst of all this going on, the two superpowers started a Cold War. Both started to stockpile as many weapons as possible, and the bigger the better. The United States of America was scared. They were worried that their American way of life would end at any moment from a Soviet nuke detonating right over them. They were worried that their family would not be safe during this time period. They were worried about the safety of the nation. With such events as the Cuban Missile Crisis from communism in the Caribbean, national defense was beginning to be a major concern. The war turned to space as the new frontier. Now the two superpowers turned the arms race into a space race. Americans were struggling to keep up with the Soviets, especially with losses to the Soviets such as Sputnik being the first satellite and the Soviets put the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin. America was not looking good. More fear was struck into the people of America from these events due to the thought that nuclear warheads would begin to rain down on them from space. The tragedy of Apollo 1 and the triumph of Apollo 11 were able to help the United States win the space race because of the better developed technology, leading to the United States gaining dominance in space. The United States was determined to beat the Soviets in the space race. They knew there would be obstacles that had never been dealt with that would need to be overcome. These often were predictable. However, it was the unpredictable events that would hurt them the most. While the rocket was on the launch pad, Gus Grissom stated,
"Hey, how are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between three buildings? I can't hear a thing you're saying. Jesus Christ."
This was the first problem that needed to be addressed. A few moments later, the most unpredictable tragedy occurred.
Hey! Oh, it's got a fire in the cockpit.
On February 21st, 1967, tragedy struck the nation. The astronauts Virgil Gus Grissom, Roger Chaffee, and Ed White lost their lives due to a fire in the cockpit. The Apollo 1 mission made the United States realize that safety needed to become a primary concern about traveling in space.
The mission of NASA is to fly safely. The first word is fly. So how do we do this safely?
Any loss of life in the space race was seen as not only a tragedy, but also a loss for the program as a whole because it meant that there would be lost time the United States did not want to give to the Soviets.
That period was a critical one to improve everything, and everything went back and was redone and rechecked, whole systems, all of them were. And in doing that, a lot of redesign was done, a lot of detailed redesign was done.
After the Apollo 1 tragedy, NASA was forced to go through their systems to make sure that they were going to fly safely.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
The United States wasn't just competing with the Soviets to get to the moon for fame, but they were competing with the Soviets for who would essentially control and lead this new unexplored frontier. By landing on the moon, the United States ended the space race with triumph, and this triumph led to continued dominance in space for the United States. Apollo 11's triumph asserted the United States as the dominant force in space. We had triumphed over the Soviets due to our better technology that was developed and understood that granted us the capability to go to the moon and back. Peace in space is continued to this day by the United States, as they often bring other countries' astronauts with them to go into space. The United States has continued its success in its space program through the Space Shuttle program, with the exception of Columbia and Challenger. The Space Shuttle program helped to construct the International Space Station, in which no one country owned. The Space Shuttle pushed us to figure out how to get larger, heavier objects into space than anything else before. Through Martian landings such as Viking 1 and Viking 2, Pathfinder, Spirit, Opportunity, Phoenix, and Insight, the United States has begun to study another planet for knowledge.
We set sail on this new sea because there is new knowledge to be gained and new rights to be won, and they must be won and used for the progress of all people. For space science, like nuclear science and all technology, has no conscience of its own. Whether it will become a force for good or ill depends on man. And only if the United States occupies a position of preeminence can we help decide whether this new ocean will be a sea of peace or a new terrifying theater of war.
Today, one of the biggest questions is whether or not space exploration is still important to be funded by taxpayers.
Space is a frontier that, while it's been many generations since we started that space exploration, that is going to be critically important for national security. It's going to be very important, I think, just for the continuing study of other planets and of the universe and what's going on other planets. It isn't simply just the next frontier, but it's something that we have to continue to invest in because we know other world-leading countries are also investing in space exploration. So truly, from a defense perspective, and with all of our technology and with satellites and everything being in space, it's critically important that we protect those assets.
The level of competition has died down severely in space, from being on the brink of nuclear war to now having some astronauts be in the other countries' missions. America has lost a great deal of interest in space exploration because we know that we are leading the frontier. But what if we weren't? Russia has not stopped its space program. China is continuing to develop its space program, and according to the Pentagon, the Chinese investments are a major concern. The United States has completed the most successful landings on Mars and also has developed satellites that have left our solar system in order to continue exploring space.
Dropped the ball for a while, and but I think it came in several ways. A lot of low Earth work was done. The space station and things before that, where we learned to live in space for long periods of time, although still within some of the shelter of the Earth.
The point is, we aren't doing the hard stuff. We settled for the safety of the Earth with low Earth orbit satellites and space stations. We haven't had a man go past the moon since the Apollo program. We haven't been doing challenging programs with humans exploring the new frontiers. We aren't being challenged, and we aren't challenging ourselves. We aren't doing what we did in space in the 1960s. Part of this is due to the fact that in the 1960s, the United States was constantly scared of the Soviet Union beating them, then using the position to drop nuclear warheads down upon the United States. That threat is not around today. Today, NASA is only getting 0.4% of the budget, where in 1965 it was getting 4%. From the lack of money, getting to the moon would take an estimated 13 years, and that would also mean that future presidents don't scrap the program. If President Kennedy were here today, he would not be impressed with what we are doing. While we have sent satellites to take pictures, we are not going out into space to expand our knowledge. The original point of a space program was to gain new knowledge. Whether this knowledge will be used for the better or worse, it should still be studied. President Kennedy believed that the United States should determine this. However, we are not.